My name's Victor. I met Malcolm when I was 12 years old. My family owned a hardware store back then, and we just shifted to a new neighborhood. My father ran the store, while my mother was a history teacher at a local elementary school. We weren't exactly millionaires, but my parents made sure I was never unhappy. I had everything I could dream of and more, which was mostly just expensive art supplies. Toying around with sketchbooks as a kid inspired me to become an artist, and while my parents weren't too keen on it as a livelihood, they supported anything that made me happy. I'd loiter around the hardware store, leaving drawings of wood, metal, and scenery scattered around the place, only for my mother to frame them up on our walls. Our house and the store were both filled with even the vaguest sketches of mine. I was desperate to pursue drawing professionally, and there was an excellent art school in the neighborhood too. I'd made up my mind and was adamant to enroll there and begin my career as an artist. Unfortunately, making up your mind is no good if you haven't got the resources to get behind your dream. Although my parents earned decently enough, it wasn't anywhere close to the exorbitant fees and deposits for the art school. I was initially disappointed, my parents were even more so, but I knew I had to adjust. They'd given me everything I could have hoped for in life, so I at least owed them this compromise. For now, with no other option in sight, the next best thing was a public school with a reputed art faculty. "It's all right, Malcolm. We can see about art school later on." "I know, Dad." "Hey, it's okay. I know it's not ideal, but we're saving up for your best future. This school's got a great art department." "So I've heard." Laughing, "Well, if it doesn't work out, there's always the hardware store." "Not if my life depended on it, Dad." "Come on now. It's not so bad." "But I'd never want you to give up on art. Never give up on your dream." It always amazed me how, despite all our circumstances, my family remained positive and hopeful as ever. It's what finally motivated me to join the public school. I vividly remember my first week there. I was never one for socializing, so public school was a bit rough, to say the least. The teachers were kind and somewhat supportive, but the students were harsh. I had little interest in sports and was mainly a creative child, which was naturally weaponized against me in a classroom setting. I went through the whole walk of shame. I was tagged as a nerd and was attached to countless other labels, but that never stopped me from continuing to pursue my art. There were some undeniably difficult days, and I remember returning home and rushing to my bedroom, miserable and wanting to leave school. Public school was going to be hard, but I never anticipated this level of bullying, name-calling, or isolation. My only safe spots became my home, the hardware store, and the drawing class in school. The professor wasn't the most encouraging, but as long as I had a place with my supplies to pursue my art, it was all I could ask for. It was in this class that I first met Quincy and Emma. Quincy was a shy guy like me, creative but soft-spoken. We struck up a great friendship over our frustrations about the school, as well as our shared love for art. Emma, on the other hand, wasn't too creative but academically a genius. She was a math and science wizard and never failed to amaze me with her knowledge. I remember the first time I saw her and spoke to her in class, I could hardly believe that was the day I met my childhood sweetheart, who would become my future girlfriend. Over time, the bitterness of school subsided and things seemed pleasant again. I had Quincy and Emma to keep me company in school, and home was steady and welcoming as always. I'd been developing a few canvas paintings, and I even enjoyed doodling my favorite comic characters with Quincy after school. Despite the initial bumps along the way, it felt as though things were finally settling again, that is until Malcolm walked into my life, threatening to shake up everything. Malcolm was a new student who joined the semester quite late. He'd moved in from a new city and was far behind on all his schoolwork. He seemed quiet during his class introduction too. He was tall, brooding, and seemed like the kind of person you didn't want to pick a fight with. He was a bit of a loner and often kept to himself in the initial few weeks, that is until our paths crossed one afternoon. I was heading back to my locker after art class and I bumped into Malcolm, spilling my supplies all over the floor. He scowled at me, furious. "Watch where you're going." "I'm sorry, I was just..." "You better not pick a fight with me, nerd, or I'll mess you up. Think of this as your first and last warning." Before I could think of a response, Malcolm stormed away. Quincy and Emma were with me, and they seemed equally shaken. I felt a rush of fear again. The initial days of bullying and torture all came surging back to my mind. Suddenly, I was afraid once more of this new potential bully. Looking back at how everything unfolded, it's hilarious how much I feared Malcolm as a teen, but I unfortunately wouldn't learn the futility of this fear until later. As I continued experimenting with my canvas drawings, dutifully finishing my homework, interacting with Quincy and Emma at school, and enjoying art class, Malcolm soon became the disruptor to this calm life of mine. Following the accidental bump in the corridor, Malcolm began deliberately spilling my art supplies or trashing my locker. Each time Quincy or Emma tried to stand up for me, he'd just threaten them into submission. Even the bullies, who would earlier come for me, now feared Malcolm. He gained a notorious reputation around the school, particularly among the teachers, and was called in for disciplinary reasons to the staff room each week. Though his looks were deceiving, Malcolm was far from dumb. He was a rather adept and intelligent student, but I couldn't figure out why he chose to act the way he did. As the weeks went by, Malcolm's bullying only worsened. He began threatening me and blindly stealing my lunch money, and any demands to stop were just met with force. One particular day changed everything. I opened my locker before art class, only to discover that all my supplies were missing. I frantically asked Quincy and Emma to look for my supplies, but the three of us couldn't find them anywhere. The obvious culprit came to mind: Malcolm. I confronted him as he coolly sat at the back of the class. "Did you take it?" Smugly, "I don't know what you're talking about." "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Give it back." "Or what?" "Which body part do you want me to break this time?" "Malcolm, you better return my supplies right now. You stole them." "Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. Maybe I just didn't want to see your pathetic loser drawings." I don't know what came over me in that moment, perhaps just raw, unfiltered rage. The teacher wasn't in class and I seized my moment. I slapped Malcolm tight and hard across his face. The entire classroom fell silent. Quincy and Emma looked horrified. Malcolm looked stunned. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Nobody could. "Oh, you little..." And then came the big blow. Malcolm leaped out of his chair and delivered a furious punch. The pain was indescribable. All I remember was falling onto the floor and being rushed to the nurse's office and then to a hospital with a broken jaw. Within the next few hours, Malcolm and I were in the principal's office. My parents had been brought in, and only Malcolm's mother, Lisa, showed up. She seemed like a mix of nervousness and fury, and for the first time, I'd seen Malcolm scared. The principal spoke for a while, but Lisa seemed ready to explode at her son. My parents were furious as well. I have to acknowledge that Victor struck Malcolm first. But we've had problems with Malcolm for a while. He's got a bad track record from his past schools too, but we decided to take him because we believe in change. However, he keeps getting worse. I'm extremely sorry for his behavior. You're sorry. My son has a broken jaw. Malcolm keeps bullying him each day. I didn't even know about him till today. Grace to principal, he stole our son's money and his supplies and beat him up this badly. What more are you waiting for?" Malcolm's mother was shaking, half caught between apologizing to my parents and screaming at her son. "I can't even imagine what your son went through. I'm very sorry and I'm willing to cover any medical bills I can, but please, I can't afford to change schools again. I beg you, please let him stay. He'll change." The principal seemed incredibly conflicted, and after a few rounds of discussion, all eyes in the room turned to me. "Well, what do you think, Victor? Do you think Malcolm deserves another chance? Can he change?" I remember everything I felt at that moment. The fury, the seething rage, the conflicting thoughts. I was only just recovering from my broken jaw and I'd already tolerated enough of his behavior. But then, in the corner of the office, I saw Malcolm shrink from a bully to a vulnerable human. I'd never seen him like this ever before. He looked like he was on the verge of tears. A bully who'd suddenly transformed into a scared child. He seemed fearful, terrified at what I was going to say next. I remember just how difficult that moment was for me. And despite everything that had happened, and much to everyone's shock, I chose forgiveness. My parents seemed baffled. Malcolm's face changed, a hopeful look in his eyes I'd never seen before. "I think he deserves another chance. I know he's bullied me and done terrible things, but I attacked him first. He seems like a bully, but I think he can change. Maybe if he tries, I guess he can." I keep wondering to this day what inspired me to make that choice. Why did I choose to forgive Malcolm? I could have thrown him under the bus, I could have gotten him expelled, but I didn't. Despite all the behavior he demonstrated towards me, I will never forget that face in the principal's office. That palpable fear humanized someone I deeply despised, and for that alone I believe Malcolm deserved another chance. Little did I know that by making this conscious choice, I had forged an unlikely friendship for life. Back at home, as I was recovering from the broken jaw, I remember my parents being upset with me for the first time ever. They were furious that I'd decided to support a bully and they feared Malcolm striking again. "I can't believe you did that, Victor. If he strikes again, you've only got yourself to blame. Why'd you forgive him?" I was honestly lost for an answer at the time. I spent a few weeks at home in recovery. Quincy and Emma would keep dropping in for visits, which significantly lifted my spirits. Emma and I would chit-chat for hours, becoming so much closer, while Quincy and I would sometimes discuss drawing ideas. I felt peaceful spending time with these two. The injury hardly seemed to matter when I was with them. However, a week before I was supposed to return to school, an unexpected visit would mark a significant chapter in my life. I remember resting on my bed, fast asleep, when I heard angry voices emerging from downstairs. Worried, I woke up instantly. Someone was at the front door. "I don't want you here. Leave right now. He's resting." I walked down the stairs and stopped dead in my tracks. I couldn't believe it. At the front door stood Malcolm, clutching a bag in his hands. He smiled slightly the moment he saw me. "Hey, how are you feeling?" My father turned around, furious to see me out of bed. "Victor, you're supposed to be resting. I'm sending him away." "Dad, just let him inside, it's okay." "Victor, I'm not tolerating this boy. He hurt my son and he's not welcome here. Leave now." "Dad, please." "It's a no, Victor." He turned to Malcolm, his rage reaching a boiling point. I'd never seen my father like this. It was the protective rage, I suppose. But how I wish he'd chosen his next words carefully. "Don't you feel ashamed? Don't you have a father who taught you kindness or compassion? Or were you always like this?" Malcolm's face immediately turned grim. Any hint of a smile vanished and his face became solemn. Without another word, Malcolm walked away, almost with a defeated attitude. My father slammed the door shut and escorted me back to my bed. But if either of us had the slightest idea about Malcolm's past, we would have been more forgiving. I returned to school the next week and was excited by the familiarity of it all. The hallways, art class, Quincy and Emma, lunch break. It felt good to finally be back. I was headed towards art class with Quincy and Emma that day, and I found a bag at my usual desk, the same bag that Malcolm had carried with him at my house the other day. I opened it and could have never guessed its contents. Quincy and Emma gathered around me as the three of us inspected the bag. It was filled with the latest art supplies, the kind of fancy stuff I'd seen on television but knew I couldn't afford. I was honestly baffled, as it was an upgraded version of all my old supplies and more. I noticed Malcolm sitting in the corner of the class, silent and daydreaming. I approached him and he immediately seemed nervous. "Hey, what's all this?" "It's nothing, just some art supplies since you didn't have new ones cause of me." "Malcolm, you didn't have to do all this." "It's okay. I just wanted to thank you, Victor." "What for?" "For believing in me. Despite everything." I wasn't sure what to think at that point, except that I was deeply touched. All my resentment seemed to take a back seat. It was shocking to me that the same bully who relentlessly tortured me was now extending an olive branch. We spoke briefly, but there was an unspoken bond that underscored all our interactions. Quincy was still very skeptical of Malcolm, and Emma was far more vengeful and angry. She still hadn't forgiven him for what he did to me, and I don't think she intended to, but both of them seemed to appreciate his gesture regardless. Time flew by, and the fighting incident soon became history. Malcolm and I didn't interact as much, and there was always a sense of distance that remained. I often noticed how alone and isolated he was in school, and although I initiated the occasional conversation, I hardly ever scratched the surface. I mainly stuck to Quincy, Emma, and a few other classmates, and remained at an arm's length from Malcolm, that is until several months later, when one afternoon changed everything. Emma was out of town on vacation with her parents, and Quincy had fallen ill that day, so neither of them had come to school. I quietly went about my lectures and left school in the afternoon. That's when I saw Malcolm sitting by the bleachers in an isolated spot. I went in closer, curious to see if he was all right, and that's when I heard the unmistakable sound of crying. Concerned, I rushed towards him. "Malcolm, is everything okay?" Malcolm turned towards me with a tear-stained face. "Just leave me alone. Get out of here." I was taken aback by his screaming and decided to walk away. I understood that he needed space and I shouldn't have approached him so hastily. I quietly walked back home. In the evening, I was at the hardware store, helping my father out with some reorganizing. I was just about finished when I saw Malcolm outside the store, reading a comic book on a nearby bench. He was most likely unaware that it was my family's store, and I decided to step out and see if he was all right after the afternoon event. "Malcolm? Are you okay?" "Victor. What are you doing here?" "I was helping my dad out. This is our family store." "What brings you here?" "I live around here. I just came for some peace. I was having a rough day." "Ah, I see. I'll leave you to it then." There was an awkward silence for a moment before Malcolm shut his comic book and kept it aside. "Not at all. Join me if you'd like." I was pleasantly surprised by his invitation, and I went back inside to tell my father that I was going out with a friend. Malcolm and I then went to a local park and ended up speaking for hours. He finally confessed to me about his crying incident and what had happened. I finally learned that Malcolm was an only child and Lisa was his foster mom. She was an absent alcoholic who struggled to make ends meet and was away on her job the whole time, leaving Malcolm alone at home. He was often punished by Lisa too, as she'd beat him up severely for misbehaving. She'd attacked him that morning itself, which explained his crying after school. But the strangest twist was that despite living with a foster mom, Malcolm knew about his birth parents. His mother had passed away when he was very young, but he knew his father. Malcolm's father was ruthless and had tortured him as a child both emotionally and psychologically. One day he couldn't take it any longer and decided to give me away. What? He just gave you away. No family member was ready to have me, so he gave me away to some orphanage, and here I am with Lisa. How could he do that? To his own son. He hated me and wanted to wash his hands off me, so this was his best option. I still took time to process what I'd just heard. All my animosity towards Malcolm slowly developed into care. I felt pity for this boy, but also relief that he'd finally chosen to share his past with me. I walked him back home that evening. He lived in a small but cozy house, and I remember seeing Lisa glaring out the window as she saw him. We said our goodbyes and I headed back home, Malcolm's past still lingering in my mind. As I sat down for dinner with my parents, my father finally asked, "So who was that friend you wanted to meet outside the store? Was it Quincy or Emma?" "No, it was." I wasn't sure how my parents would react, but I didn't want to lie to them either. They deserved to know the truth about him too. "It was actually Malcolm." My father's face turned into shock as my mother looked at me, disappointed. "Victor, what are you doing with that boy? Did he do something again? Is he threatening you again?" No. Dad, just let me explain." And so I did. My parents listened to everything patiently, and I could see their faces shifting from malice to compassion for Malcolm. I even told them about the expensive art supplies he bought for me, to which my parents felt silent, conflicted about what to say. Oh my God, I never expected that boy to have such a horrible past. It's awful. I think his mother beats him up almost every day. I guess that explains his troubled past. I can't believe I said all those terrible things to him. About his father. I didn't know. It's all right, Dad. Now we know. I guess we can help him now. Yes, we should. My parents didn't say more that evening, but the next day, they asked me to invite Malcolm home for lunch. It was a weekend and I visited Malcolm's house that morning, asking him if he'd like to come over. I remember how nervous he looked, as if something had happened between Lisa and him, but he managed to sneak out with me anyway. On our way to my house, he was endlessly grateful and excited. Back at home, my parents sat down with Malcolm and me, and my father struck up a conversation with him. "I just want to apologize for the way I treated you and spoke to you that day, Malcolm. I crossed a line I shouldn't have." "Not at all. I apologize, sir, for what I did to Victor. I'll never be able to apologize enough." "Oh, come on now, my jaw's fine." There was mild laughter which soon evolved into free-flowing conversations over lunch. My parents warmed up to Malcolm, and for a moment as we had lunch, it felt as though they were truly caring for a second son. Much to my surprise, this was the very beginning of a beautiful friendship and a strong bond between Malcolm and my parents as well. I later learned that Malcolm was interested in writing and was an excellent creative writer. This creative bond only strengthened our friendship. Back at school, I invited Malcolm to come interact with Quincy and Emma during lunch break. They still seemed hesitant, but after Malcolm's kindness and open admission about his past, they gradually opened up to him too. Their anger and fear dissipated as the weeks and months went by, and Malcolm became a significant friend in my life, and grew especially close to both my parents as well as Quincy and Emma. Soon enough, it became a tradition at my home to have Malcolm over each weekend for some lunch and conversation. Quincy and Emma joined us too whenever they could, and it was beautiful to have this group around me. Given the past, this felt like the strangest thing to witness. From the continuous bullying to being the big brother I never had, I could have never predicted that Malcolm would become such an integral part of my life. But as painstaking as it was, I soon learned that happiness is only short-lived and things were about to change once again. During a regular day at school, Malcolm, Quincy, Emma and I were at the back of the art class, enjoying ourselves. Suddenly, a senior teacher walked in. "Who's Malcolm?" The class turned silent and all eyes fell on Malcolm. "That's me. Your mother's here to pick you up. She says it's an emergency." I distinctly remember Malcolm's face. He seemed unusually tense. "Hey, is everything okay?" "Yeah, I guess I'll go see what this is about." Malcolm stepped out of the class with the teacher, and even as our class resumed, Quincy, Emma and I waited with bated breath to learn what all this was about. Sometime later, Malcolm returned to class and began packing his bag. The three of us looked at him, concerned, but Malcolm didn't say a word. What worried me the most was his face. It was the same fearful expression, the one I'd seen in the principal's office all those months ago. My mind was racing with possibilities, but before I could ask him anything, Malcolm walked out of the classroom with his things. After school, the three of us rushed to his house, determined to make sure he was all right, but we could have never predicted what happened next. As we arrived at his location, we noticed that his house was empty, with a for sale sign on the front lawn. This can't be. Did he just leave? Where did he go? Why didn't he say anything? I just hope he's okay, wherever he is. I can't believe he just left. The three of us stood shocked, wondering what hand had fate dealt to our friend. I returned home and shared the news with my parents, who were surprised and immediately worried. I'd heard only the worst things about Lisa from Malcolm, which only intensified my fear that something terrible had happened. Malcolm returned to school a full 2 days later. He seemed quiet, as if all energy and happiness had been drained out of him. When Quincy, Emma and I approached him during lunch break, he was hesitant to open up to us, but he finally did. "We've shifted to a new house. My mother doesn't want to live here anymore." "But why? What happened?" "Turns out my father had been paying rent for this house, but he decided he didn't want to pay anymore. He was giving Lisa some money to take care of me, but he decided he'd been wasting too much money on me. So now, well, he doesn't want to pay anymore, which means Lisa's got to find a job again. We can figure something out. You can stay with me." "That's never going to happen, Victor. Lisa won't let it, nor would my father. I can't get rid of them." It was heartbreaking to hear how defeated Malcolm sounded, and he began to isolate himself once again from Quincy, Emma, me, and pretty much everyone at school. Despite our best efforts to help support him, Malcolm only became more distant. He began coming to school looking haggard and thinner each day. I once spoke to him outside class, when I noticed severe bruise marks and cuts around his body. "Malcolm, what is this?" "It's nothing, it's just..." Lisa got angry again. "It's okay." Looking back on everything, I had to admire the resilience within that boy. Over time, Malcolm started bunking school more often. He was absent half the time, and all of us kept wondering where he'd disappeared. He refused to let us see his new home and would often end up with injury marks and seemed exhausted. One afternoon, I finally followed him home, and I couldn't believe what I saw. Malcolm was living in an almost ramshackle house in a shady neighborhood. When he noticed that I'd followed him, he began screaming. "I told you not to come here, Victor. Just go. Leave me alone." I desperately wished I could have done something to help him. I went home and let my parents know about the situation. My father drove us down to Malcolm's house that night, carrying food and school supplies for him. However, Lisa answered the front door and things turned into an ugly spat. "What do you want?" "We just came to drop some things off for Malcolm, see how he's doing, and..." "He's doing fine. Now get out of my house. I don't want to see you lot here again." She slammed the door shut before any of us could react. As we drove back home, our concern for Malcolm continued to grow. My parents kept sending food parcels to give to Malcolm in school. They also added small allowances in the parcel since Lisa had been struggling financially. While Malcolm would accept those parcels, he remained isolated from us and absent most days. Quincy, Emma, and I would sneak to his house to visit him, but Lisa wouldn't let him leave her sight. In a shocking twist, we even learned that Malcolm had been working as a mopper at a local cafe. By chance, I was walking by the cafe, and that's where I saw him one evening. He looked in a condition I'd never seen him in before. "Malcolm, what are you doing here?" He paused what he was doing and came over to me briefly. "Hey, Victor, it's just some work. It's okay. I'm doing it for Lisa. She's not been able to get a job. Figured I'd help out." "You're still in school, Malcolm. You shouldn't be doing this. If you want, I could speak to Dad. Heck, you could work at the hardware store if you want." No, it's okay, Victor. It's really nice to see you. I'll catch you later." "But Malcolm, what about the allowance from the parcels?" "Well, actually, Lisa's been taking those and..." A manager's voice echoed from inside the cafe, and Malcolm bid me a quick goodbye and left in a hurry. I couldn't believe it. Lisa had been keeping all of Malcolm's money to herself. Her abuse truly knew no bounds. I continued to wonder about Malcolm's worsening state and how we could help him overcome this life. And suddenly, an idea struck me. I called Quincy and Emma that very day to discuss it with them. What if we host a student fundraiser for Malcolm? Quincy and I could sell our art. Emma, you could help organize the whole thing, and we could invite students, teachers, and everyone. That's not such a bad idea, but not everybody likes Malcolm. How do you know everyone will show up? He's having a difficult time, worse than any student at school right now. We could make it about his education. He shouldn't have to work for school fees when he's 12. I'm sure we could get all students and teachers to chip in, most of them if not all. And so the plan began. Emma began organizing the fundraiser and speaking to the teachers and students, while Quincy and I began working on our art pieces and the different themes we planned to create. We'd kept the whole thing a surprise from Malcolm, who'd rarely ever come to school now, but we were desperate in our resolve to help him. As the day of the fundraiser drew closer, preparations were in full swing, with even Quincy and Emma's parents helping us set things up. Finally, when the day arrived, we went as a small group to visit Malcolm's house and call him to witness the fundraiser. Unfortunately, Lisa answered the front door, and as we explained the situation to her, her face surprisingly changed to one of joy. "That sounds delightful. I'd love to come." Malcolm would gladly join, but he's feeling terribly sick. He's been sleeping upstairs in his room all day, but I'd love to join all of you. All of us were quite disappointed by this turn of events, but we were determined to help Malcolm's cause. We asked to meet Malcolm, but Lisa told us that he'd been sleeping all morning and didn't want to be disturbed. That sounded very unlike Malcolm, but us being kids, we couldn't doubt the adult. "There's food in the house and he's all fine. I'll come along with you, don't you worry about your friend." There was obvious skepticism on my mind, especially with the allowances she'd taken from Malcolm, but we decided to trust her one last time. Oh, how unbelievably stupid we all were. The fundraiser was fantastic. My parents, along with Quincy and Emma's parents, had invited their friends and children too, which only strengthened the overall crowd at the event. It was a joyous day, and everyone took turns to speak about their interactions with Malcolm and how they hoped he would become better again. It was a resounding success. Throughout all of this, Lisa seemed to be enjoying the festivities and delivered a tearful speech about Malcolm, expressing her hope that their situation improve. This caught all of us off guard, and just for a moment, we began to think Lisa was being genuine. As the event came to a close, all the collected money was delivered straight to Malcolm's house and placed in Lisa's hands. We begged her to see Malcolm at least once, but she insisted that he was unwell and not up for visitors. I was still hesitant to give the exorbitant amount we'd raised entirely to Lisa, but given the number of people involved, including our parents, we had little reason to believe she would misuse the funds. However, all of us had severely underestimated this woman's cruelty. The next morning, I woke up to find a letter delivered to my front door. I opened it and saw that it was from Malcolm. I was immediately excited, hoping our friend was feeling better again and had received the money. But as fate would have had it, Malcolm was in for worse. It was a one-page letter written in haste, but reading it only made me shake with anger and disappointment. "Victor, I'm writing this to you as fast as I can before I'm forced to leave. I couldn't meet all of you yesterday as Lisa had gotten drunk and beaten me severely all morning, way worse than she ever has. My condition was just hopeless and I couldn't even stand up. I'm writing to you now because Lisa has stolen all the money you guys gave her and has run away. She got in touch with my father, who's here to take me away now. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm very sorry to have wasted all your efforts. Thank you for your friendship and love. I won't be coming to school anymore. I guess I'll see all of you one day. Take care, Victor." My mind was numb the moment I finished reading the letter. A sense of regret, frustration, and helplessness came over me all at once. Why did I trust Lisa even after knowing about the allowances? Why didn't we all do enough to make sure he was okay? How could we have let this happen? Endless questions, doubts, and frustrations circled my mind, wondering about Malcolm's fate and what was going to happen next. The events that followed were a blur. I remember informing everyone about what had happened and all the chaos that unfolded. With a heavy heart and still grappling with all the shocking events, it appeared that we had to move past everything that had happened with Malcolm. Time continued marching forward. I passed out of school, met more friends, and explored more hobbies. I kept on working on my art, collaborating with Quincy while growing closer to Emma. Eventually, over one beautiful dinner, I asked Emma out and the two of us began officially dating. I struggled in a life post-Malcolm and in the aftermath of everything that had happened, but having Emma and Quincy by my side made me more optimistic about life. 10 years later, in a full-circle moment, I finally applied to that expensive art school I'd compromised on before going to public school. We'd taken out a student loan, but my parents and I were overjoyed regardless. I celebrated with them and Emma the day I got in. It was truly a beautiful moment. The art school was excellent. Their graduate program was exactly what I'd been seeking and more. Emma got into her dream medical college too, and I couldn't be happier that we both secured the colleges we'd wished for. I worked as a waiter at a local bar to cover college tuition, but I didn't mind it at all. However, despite everything going just right in life, I couldn't get Malcolm out of my mind. I'd still get the occasional memories, continuously wondering where he was and if he was all right. Again, fate has the strangest ways of surprising us, and things took the most unexpected turn one evening. I was just finishing up with waiting tables and was the last waiter there. My shift was about to wrap up when a strange man walked into the bar. He was looking for someone. He met my manager and I heard my name being mentioned. I was immediately curious as my manager turned towards me. "Victor, this gentleman's here to see you." I was curious about who this man was. He introduced himself as someone called Zachary. "It's nice to meet you, Victor. You don't know me, but my boss has been looking for you." Suddenly, my heart filled up with hope. Could it be Malcolm? "Who's your boss?" "Mr. Ziegler would like to discuss matters in private. Would you come with me if you're free?" "Who's Mr. Ziegler?" "Malcolm Ziegler? I'm afraid I can't say much, except he'd like to meet you." Curious, I went along with Zachary once my shift ended. He drove us downtown to a fancy building, apparently owned by Mr. Ziegler. Each mention of this enigmatic figure was making me increasingly nervous. We entered the building and Zachary led me to an office. My heart was beating ridiculously fast, and my mind braced for a potential reunion with Malcolm. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. An old man occupied the office and he invited me to take a seat. I waited for him to explain what was going on. "Firstly, I'm delighted to meet you. You're Victor, right?" "Yes, I am." Good, good. You're the one who went to that public school on the outskirts of town?" "That's right." "So you know someone called Malcolm?" My heart began beating faster. The mere mention of his name all these years later made me suddenly anxious and sent an adrenaline rush through my system. "Yes, of course I know Malcolm. What about him? Is he okay? I was wondering the same thing. I'm concerned about him. I haven't heard from him lately." "Why, has something happened? Did he work for you?" "Well, the thing is, I'm Malcolm's father." I could hardly believe my senses at that moment. "What, you're his father?" "Yes. Malcolm used to work at one of my factories, but he ran away just recently. Nobody's heard from him. I'm worried about my son. Please help me." Fury overcame me, and I couldn't control myself. "You ruined your son. You sick man. Now, you worried about him. You ought to rot in jail. How dare you? Get out." My screaming attracted a lot of unwanted attention, and I was escorted out of the premises. As I returned to campus, a million thoughts swirled through my head. Why was Malcolm's father looking for him? I shared this with Emma on one of our late-night phone calls. She was equally curious and eager to know where Malcolm was. I don't know what came over me, but as the weekend approached, I decided I wanted to use these 2 days to track down my friend. I took 2 days off work and returned to my neighborhood. I visited my old school and asked around, but nobody seemed to remember Malcolm anymore. I searched every place imaginable the cafe worked, the area outside my family's hardware store, and his previous 2 houses, but Malcolm was nowhere to be found. Exhausted, I believed he'd skipped town and was in some remote part of the country. I was about to leave when I saw a strange figure in the park, the same park where Malcolm had first told me all about his past. There was a disheveled man, writing something in a diary. It was unmistakable. Malcolm. The man turned around. I nearly teared up. I couldn't believe it after all this time. What, Victor? The 2 of us rushed to embrace each other. It was an incredible reunion after all this time. I treated him to dinner and the 2 of us went for a drive wherein Malcolm finally solved the mystery of his disappearance for me. He revealed that after Lisa escaped with the money, his father was furious that he had to take him back. He decided to make Malcolm work at a factory as one of his laborers so that he could prove he deserved his father's care. There were marks all over Malcolm's body, presumably from all the years of labor and abuse he endured at his father's hands. He confessed that he worked this way for 10 years, being unable to pursue even a proper education because of his father. I kept writing though, and I remembered all of you. I never forgot any of you. I was speechless after having heard everything. I informed him that his father was looking for him and had found his way to me too. How come he's looking for you? After everything. And then Malcolm dropped the bombshell. I've been working at the factory for 10 years, but I only recently started hearing things. What kind of things? I heard stories about an employee my father threatened and intimidated. It was a hush-hush affair, and people weren't supposed to speak about it. But then, a couple of the workers began talking, and turns out there have been dozens of such cases by my father. Oh my God, dozens. And I have the documents and evidence. That's why I ran away, and that's why he's been looking for me, Victor. I had no idea he'd reach you. I'm so sorry. What do you plan on doing, Malcolm? He's desperate to find you. I'm afraid, Victor. If he's found you, it's only a matter of time before he gets to me. We both sat in silence, realizing the gravity of the situation, and then, well, I was thinking, what? What if we made it public? The evidence. Your father deserves it. You deserve justice. I was meeting Malcolm after a decade, but the hope in his eyes was as unmistakable as ever, and I saw it once again. That's too dangerous, Victor. What if it doesn't work out? What if he finds us? What if we get caught? Let's figure it out together. But first, let's get you somewhere safe. I drove Malcolm to my parents' house, who were shocked to see both of us. I explained the entire situation to them, and they jumped to Malcolm's care. They agreed to care for Malcolm and assured him that he could consider our home as his own. As he explained about Ziegler and the evidence, my father and I insisted that it be shared in the press. Malcolm had endured enough. His entire childhood was spent at the mercy of his father. We consulted my uncle, who was a newspaper editor, and after discussing things for a few days and with Malcolm's consent, we decided to anonymously leak the information to the press. The next few days that followed were turbulent yet satisfying. The news of Malcolm's father became a massive story, and Malcolm himself came forward and testified to the press and police about his years of abuse and mistreatment. What's more, as a result of all the attention around the case, we were able to track down Malcolm's orphanage and find Lisa, who was brought to light as well for what she did to Malcolm. The case didn't die down anytime soon, but the fact that these 2 perpetrators were now held accountable for everything they put Malcolm through was more satisfying than any of us could have ever hoped for. Helping Malcolm finally avenge all those years of abuse and giving it back to Lisa and his father was more satisfying than I could have ever imagined, and for the first time in his life, Malcolm was free. The revenge had been served.